Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of the year. It's the Goat Essentials webinar, part 1. I'm Dominic Enter, I'm the Livestock Project Officer at StockSense. Bit about the project. StockSense is run by the VFF, which is funded by the Cattle Compensation Fund and the Sheep and Goat Compensation Fund, and proudly delivered by the VFF's Livestock Group. It was established to help Victorian livestock producers maintain and improve animal health and welfare and Victoria's overall biosecurity status. We do this through workshops across Victoria. We have a number of webinars each year, fact sheets on our website, and we have a social media platform, and we also have a quarterly newsletter, which is emailed out. We have a couple of cracking upcoming events. Next week on the 6th of February, we have part 2 of this webinar series. And it's worth mentioning it's the same link as tonight. So if you use the same link, same Zoom link, you'll be able to access that webinar. And that's presented by Dr. Sandra Baxendale, who will cover pregnancy, toxemia, kidding, and care of newborns. We have another great workshop, this time on the 28th of February in Winton, Victoria, and that will be on goat foot pairing. And there's a couple of vets who will be demonstrating, and you'll likely get a chance to have a go yourself. So I highly recommend that if you're near the Winton area. And for anyone who has cows and calves, I thought it's worth mentioning, we also have a calving webinar series in March on the 18th and 19th. If you'd like to sign up to any of those, our website is vff.org.au/StockSense, or you can email us. There's our email. Your feedback is very important to us. It's how we can improve these webinars and also workshops. So at the end of this webinar, there'll be a link for the feedback. Also, it's worth noting if there's something we haven't covered tonight or previously and you'd like covered in the future, note that down and we can try to fit that one in next time. So tonight's schedule, we're very lucky to have Dr. Marisa Wood with us. She's a veterinarian living in Perth, and she's from California originally. She is a practicing livestock vet. Marisa studied at the Murdoch University and completed her master's in 2023 in research around alternative worm treatments for goats, particularly Barber's pole worm. That'll be the main topic tonight. If you have any questions, please type them in the box. It's roughly going to be a 1-hour presentation, and there'll be 30 odd minutes for questions afterwards. And these slides and recording will be emailed to you tomorrow. So with that, I think I'll stop sharing my screen and welcome you, Marisa. Thanks for joining us tonight. Cheers.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Perfect.
Hopefully, great. Thanks so much for the lovely introduction. So I am Dr. Marisa. My last name's actually just recently changed because I recently got married, so I'm undergoing that whole process, but you just call me Marisa. And thanks StockSense for putting on this webinar. I'm super excited to talk about worms in goats with you. This is something I could talk for hours about. It's a bit of a passion project. I've spent many, many, many hours researching this, and I just think it's really important, and I love to share any information I can. So let's get into it. So why learn this information? Because worms, specifically a Barber's pole worm, has a high rate of death. So it can cause chronic wasting, so sort of just weight loss over time, or it can cause acute death. So basically just goats can drop dead immediately. It's quite a nasty disease. And unfortunately, when it comes to the drugs to treat this parasite and the worms, there's not that many registered drugs on the market for goats. And there's a lot of drug resistance. So the parasites themselves can actually genetically mutate to resist that treatment. So using the chemicals isn't necessarily the best option for everyone all the time. So that's why we'll talk about a lot of different potential control strategies that you can use in your goats and on your property. It is important to note that worm control in goats is not a one size fits all. There's never going to be, this is the one method that you should do and only this method. I think the best way to approach controlling internal parasites on your farm is picking a wide variety of methods and that you can use specifically for your goats on your property, because each method will be different for different people. So that's why I'm here to provide you basically a giant list of potential methods that you can use to create a plan on your property and minimize the risk of disease in your goats. All this information that I'm about to provide is based on the research that I did in 2023, a couple of years ago. I did a bunch of research, a literary review, and then based on that information, I created a survey that was sent out to Australian goat owners. So that's everyone that responded in the survey. There was 315 people included all across Australia. And the point of the project was to find the applied knowledge gaps based on the evidence-based effective methods for controlling Haemonchus contortus, which is Barber's bollworm in goats. So I basically wanted to see what are all the effective methods and what are the methods that people aren't really utilizing as much as maybe they could be. And one of the questions that I asked in the survey was to describe your challenges with this parasite, with worms. And these were some of the responses that I got. The size corresponds to the frequency. Some of these might, if you've been struggling to manage worms in your herd already, some of these might resonate with you, such as maybe you've got dairy goats and maybe you're struggling with the withholding periods or picking the right drug, or maybe you're struggling accessing a vet that knows about goats. Maybe you're struggling diagnosing the disease or managing resistance or the land that you have. So lots of potential issues. Now, I've tried to keep this presentation as simple as possible to understand. However, there are a few terms that I just want to make sure that sort of everyone is on the same page, because there's some acronyms and it can get a little bit complicated. So firstly, the drench, it's a very commonly used word, but I've actually met some people who don't know what that means. And that's basically a veterinary drug that's targeted to kill parasites. The drug active is the specific chemical compound of the drug. So for example, Q drench has 4 active ingredients. FEC is also known as a fecal egg count or a worm egg count. And that's basically when you count the number of the parasite eggs that's in the poop. And often there's a mix of different species of parasites. An FECRT, or a fecal egg count reduction test, it sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. It's basically 2 fecal egg counts. So 2 samples of the poop. And the first one is on the day that you drench, so day 0. And then the second one is 14 days later. And you basically take the numbers of each of them, and you're calculating the reduction in the worms. So you're basically just calculating the difference, and you want a greater than 95% reduction, ideally greater than 98%. To know that, and the purpose of this is to determine if the drench drug that you're using, if it actually works. Because like I said before, the parasites can develop resistance by genetically mutating. And it is important to know that it works, because otherwise you might think that you're treating, but you're actually not. And so that could just lead to further disease or death in your goats. The PCV, that's the packed cell volume. So that's basically just the volume of the red blood cells in the blood. The larval culture or differentiation is just another test that that the labs can do on the poop to identify the specific parasite. Refugia is a term you may or may not have heard. It's basically means leaving some worms on the pasture, so in the environment, and leaving them that are the ones that are ideally susceptible to the drug that you're using, so that there's less of a chance to create resistance with that genetic mutation from the parasites. And a withholding period, this one's quite important. Some of you may or may not have heard this term before, but when a vet writes a prescription for the drug, for the drench drug, which is legally required, they need to know the amount of time from when the drug is used to when the product is safe to consume. So if you have milking goats, if you have meat goats, or if you have fiber goats, there's a length of time from when the drug is actually going to be found in that animal product. So it is very important to wait that appropriate amount of time, and to make sure that you've got that withholding period with your prescription, because it comes down to human health, right? We don't necessarily want to be eating or drinking these drugs in our animal products. We don't want the residues in it. So let's get into it. So super important is to make a plan. With these parasites, it's like a battle, right? So you need to have a plan of attack, because they're always going to be there. And if you've got goats or sheep or camelids, they're going to be there. And so you need a plan to manage them. If you don't have a plan, then everything can kind of get willy-nilly, and you can't really keep track of what's happening, what things are working, or who has the disease, or who's getting better, things like that. So just make a plan. Using a vet can be super, super helpful to make this plan, because people like me and Dr. Sandra know a wide variety of strategies that will help you make this plan. If anything, utilize these strategies that I'm talking about to make your own plan. And using a vet or a nutritionist to create a nutritional plan is also super important, because there's something called basically immunity through nutrition. And if our nutritional needs are met, so like our energy, our protein, and our micronutrients, like our vitamins and minerals, if those nutritional needs are met, then our body, right, our as in us and the goats that we have, right, is going to be the best equipped to fight any infection. So getting that nutrition is super important, so you can just create stronger animals. And utilizing in your plan, if you do breed, and again, remember, this is not a one size fits all, so not all options will be the best options for everyone. So ignore them if you don't breed your goats. But if you do breed your goats, consider using buck breeding values. I think this is quite an underutilized tool. It's found by the company, the website Sheep Genetics. So this can be quite helpful to make a plan as part of a breeding plan. So there's 3 steps to creating your worm control plan. Each step has a bunch of different options. So in step 1, we're going to address the goats themselves. We're going to talk about targeted selective treatment. So that's basically identifying which goats need to be treated. We're going to talk about knowing your obligations. So like your legal and health and safety obligations, like I said before with the withholding periods and prescriptions. So that's really important. And then we're going to talk about different alternative treatments and supplements that you can give and how to utilize genetics. Targeted selective treatment is identifying goats needing treatment. So remember, these are the tools that the bottom half of the goat owners in my research used. So there's a lot of different targeted selective treatment methods out there, but these are ones that I think and that my research shows are being underutilized. So that's why I'm highlighting them here, because there's a lot of potential options control methods. So scoring the coat condition, that can be useful. Using a FAMACHA card, which we'll talk about, and I'll show you a picture that quantifies the amount of anemia based on the color of the mucous membrane of the eye, because the Barber's poleworm sucks blood from the goat, so it's going to cause anemia. And doing a fecal egg count or that larval culture and differentiation test every 4 to 8 weeks. So this is especially important if your goats live in an area that you know has a massive worm problem. So if your goats have been fine for ages, they're all pretty stable, none of them have lost weight, they've never had diarrhea, they're all happy, healthy, then, and they've been like that forever, then maybe worms isn't a massive issue on your property. But if you know that you have worms, or if your goats just maybe aren't as healthy as they could be, then definitely doing some regular fecal egg counts is very helpful, because that's going to help actually diagnose the disease, the parasites, and not only diagnose, but quantify the burden. So by telling you exactly how many eggs are in this the poop at this period of time. This is the FAMACHA card that I was mentioning. In order to get this card, you do need special training. Mostly it's just physically like how to use the card, what the card means, how to interpret it, and then how to utilize it in the broader context of worm control and targeted selective treatment. So there's a few people that offer training. If you are interested in getting this card for your goats to use at home, then just let me know and I can help point you in the right direction. So this basically, number 1 is the darkest mucous membrane color, and that's going to be the highest. It correlates with the packed cell volume. So remember, that's the amount of red blood cells in the blood, and the white is basically the lowest. So that's severely anemic. Like, these guys do not have enough blood; they are on death's door. So it is a very useful tool for determining if your goat is anemic and if they potentially need to be treated as well, right? So that the more anemic they are, then that's potentially an issue, because Barber's poleworm is very common. It's a very common cause of anemia in goats. These are just some photos of a fecal egg count. So these fecal egg counts you actually can do them at home. You can send them off to there's some people that accept samples via shipping, and then there's a lot of vets that will do fecal egg counts if you've got a local vet. And the pictures at the bottom right are of strong guile eggs. So these are the main worms in goats that we're counting. Next is knowing your obligations. So it's very important to receive a prescription from a vet for all your drench drugs. It's also important to note that goats do need a different dose than what's on the label, because most grand majority of the products are labeled for sheep, and goats are not sheep. Their metabolisms work differently, so they actually need a higher and different dose rate. So legally, that different dose rate needs to be given to you by a vet, but also it's important to have that prescription so that you're giving the dose that will work on your goats, and so that you can get that withholding period. So remember, that's the safe period of time for when the drug was given and when you can consume that product safely. Here are some different types of treatments and supplements that you can consider doing with your goats. So BioWorma is it's an oral powdered supplement, so that's given in feed, and that is basically, it sounds very weird, but it's the spores of a fungus and the fungus basically kills the larvae of the worms in the poop. So the point of it is it's reducing the amount of larvae that the goats are picking up on the pasture. So it's reducing the amount of worms in the environment, and it's very effective. It's it kills over 80% of the larvae, and there's lots of research done on it, and lots of anecdotal experiences as well on people that use this product on their herds. The only thing is you do need to make sure that the goats are eating it orally. So if you don't feed any supplements that you can mix it in, then obviously the goats aren't going to be able to be dosed. So that's one to consider. Copper oxide wire particle. That is, again, another oral supplement. So this does need a vet prescription because it's not registered for use to control worms. It's registered in goats, but not for worm control. So if you're giving it more than one time a year and to control the worms, then you do need a vet prescription for this. And different size goats will need different amounts. So it is important to make sure that you're giving the right amount to avoid copper toxicity, but it's reasonably safe. And you can also give the copper oxide wire particles with the drench product that you're giving at the same time to potentially increase the effectiveness. Then there's some specific diet related things to think about. So when you're making your nutritional plan, definitely consider giving a protein rich supplement. So things like lupins or soy or copper meal, they've all got quite high protein. So again, that will boost the nutritional immunity and make sure that your goat's protein needs are being met. You can give a non-protein nitrogen supplement. And then there's also something called a sustained release trace element bolus. So this again needs a vet prescription. So it's something worth talking to your vet about. Essentially what this is it's a capsule that goes down the goat's throat, sits in the rumen, in the stomach of the goat, and then slowly, I think it lasts maybe 6 or 9 months, slowly releases the micronutrients. So this is instead of giving a lick block or loose minerals or something in the water. The reason why this is, I guess, why I would prefer this instead of a separate lick block or something is because it's it's a bit more accurate dosing, so you know that they have it in them and it's slowly releasing over time versus like them having to go to the lick block and lick it and get enough minerals from that. So you sort of know that their micronutrients are covered. And it's especially important in areas where you know that there's a lot of nutritional deficiencies in your specific area or your soils. And if or when you supplement extra protein and energy, supplementing it around the kidding time, so 2 weeks before to 6 weeks after kidding, can be super valuable. And because this is when the does are extra susceptible to internal parasites. So boosting that immunity through nutrition at that time is super helpful. Another option that, again, requires a vet prescription, so worth talking to your vet about, is called the Barber vaccine. That's a vaccine specifically for the Haemonchus contortus parasite. These are the copper oxide wire particles that I was talking about. So it's just little, sort of like almost like grains of rice, little pieces of copper inside the capsule. So you can either give it as a capsule or sprinkle it on feed or something. But again, chat to your vet more about that. And if they don't know what it is, then they can do some research or they can ask me or another vet who knows something. Genetics, super important if you breed your goats. Removing goats that need frequent drench treatments or that consistently have high fecal egg counts is very valuable, because these ones, they're always just going to be susceptible. They're going to be shedding a lot of parasites on your farm, and you're just always going to have to treat them and deal with them. So if you don't need them in your herd, and if you don't want to continue to have to deal with them, then sort of moving them on is a good idea. Using a fecal egg count at or before weaning or when they're greater than a year old, using that number to select goats for breeding can be a very valuable tool. So that's just picking the ones that have, like, breeding the ones with lower fecal egg counts at that time. Same thing with the Haemonchus scores. So selecting the goats that have darker mucous membranes, selecting those for breeding instead of ones that just have the more pale or white mucous membranes. And then there's excuse me, a few specific values that are found on Kid Plan. So that's resistance to worms, growth, and worm egg count. Fecal egg count, that's on Kid Plan. And then there's the packed cell volume, which you can also use that number to select goats for breeding. That's very similar to the Haemonchus score, and it's just a little bit more, requires a little bit more equipment because you need to take a blood sample for it, just a small bit of blood. So that's would typically be more done by a vet, but the Haemonchus score you can do by yourself just with the card. That's all you need and the knowledge. Cool. So that was looking at the goat themselves. Next, let's look at the specific parasite. So I'm not going to delve into the specifics about the types of parasites. This is more just treatments for the parasites, because all the stuff that you do will help all the parasites. So let's talk about who will you drench? How much will you give? How will you do it? And does your drench work? Who will you drench? This is very similar to that targeted selective treatment idea, right? So identifying the ones that need to be treated versus just blanket treating all the goats at the same time, maybe according to a schedule or something like that, right? So we're not talking about, oh, every 3 months or every 6 months, let's just drench all of them. Or when they're weaned, let's drench all of them. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about deciding which specific goats need the treatment, right? Need the drench. And if you do this, it will save you money because you're using less of the drug, right? By not treating everyone. So you might only need to treat, X percent versus the whole herd. The body condition score, that's a very useful tool. If you don't know about body condition score, definitely look that up. There's some great videos online and some PDF documents with some awesome photos and descriptions. So that's basically just identifying the skinny versus fat goats and the ones in between. So if they've got a low body condition score that's less than 2 out of 5, then these are the ones that are considered skinny and are likely have a worm burden, or there's something else going on because they're just not, they're losing condition, or they're just not putting on weight like they should. So there's some sort of a deficiency. And the internal parasites, the worms, if they have a high burden, they basically they'll suck the blood, they'll mess with the guts of the animals, making them not able to absorb as much nutrients as they normally would. So that's why they're losing weight. Using the Haemonchus score, like we talked about, using a specific cutoff for drenching. So this is based on your fecal egg count. So instead of just, drenching everyone, it's let's take some poop samples, count how many worm eggs are in the poop, and then using that information, we'll decide who to drench. So cutoff generally recommended is over 500, although often recommended for dry or adult goats over 750 eggs per gram. So using over 500 for the susceptible ones, so the pregnant, the lactating, and the weaners. Using drenching a goat kid at weaning, they're more susceptible, or a goat that's about to kid, they're also more susceptible. Or deciding a production threshold for your system. So if let's say you've got a herd of goats for meat, and every X months you bring them in and weigh them, and then let's say there's maybe 20% of them that just aren't putting on the weight that you would expect them to gain in that amount of time, then that could be your threshold. And you can say, okay, well, maybe I'll either drench those, or I'll also, Haemonchus score them, or body condition score them, or get fecal egg counts to see if they're suffering from worms, and that's why they're losing weight or not gaining the expected weight. And it is important to leave at least some of your goats untreated. So 10% is recommended, and that's that refugia concept that we talked about. So that's to minimize the parasites mutating to resist the chemical treatment. How much drench will you give? So using the dose prescribed by your vet is important. However, goats are not cheap, and not all vets know the appropriate goat dose rates. It's very unfortunate. So if your vet needs to be educated, and you can send them some information, or you can say, hey vet, can you have a chat to me or another vet that knows about goat specific dose rates and information? Can you talk to them about the drench rates if they're using the sheep dose rate? Can you have a chat to them and then get back to me with a new prescription, or with a prescription that has the appropriate dose rate? That's very important, because you want to make sure that if you're using the drug treatment, you want to make sure that it works. Using a method to appropriately dose the goat. So either weighing them, or using a weight tape, or estimating the weight, the heaviest one in the group, and then giving them all sort of that one. how are you going to do it? Again, lots of options on things to add to your plan. But if you feel like you can do any of these, then add it to your plan. That's reducing or restricting food before or after drenching or both. That's using a combination of 2 drug actives on the same day. So remember that'll be like a levamisole and fenbendazole. Those are 2 active. Or a Q drench, which has 4 actives in it. Or splitting the dose into 2 parts and giving it at 2 separate times within 24 hours. Oh, and I just want to mention that so there's a lot of drench products out there, and it can be a bit overwhelming to figure out which one you should use. The oral, so the ones that go in the mouth are the most effective in goats. The ones that get injected or that go on the skin topically, those aren't as effective as the ones that go in the mouth. So sticking to the oral products and then sticking to these recommendations as, and again, make sure that you're working with your vet, but as a first line, using for goats that aren't milking for human consumption, using the Q drench, and then as a first line for goats that are milking for human consumption, using either levamisole or fenbendazole. And those are just 2 different brands of fenbendazole. And how will you know if your drench actually works? Because that's super important. Calibrate it. You can if you're using a dosing gun, you can calibrate it every once in a while using a measuring cylinder. So that's just actually making sure that the amount that you're squirting into the goat is the amount that you set it to, the amount that you actually want to come out. And then also just having a look to make sure that the gun isn't broken or damaged. It's important. You can do that fecal egg count reduction test. And ideally, you're doing that about once a year, if not more. And especially if you buy a new drench, so like let's say you finish the bottle of your product, and then you want to buy a new one. Well, let's just make sure that it actually works, that the one that you're using works. And before you invest in a whole new bottle, you might as well. Cool. So we've talked about it's important to make a plan. It's important to address the goat, address the parasite. And lastly, I just want to touch on addressing the environment. So we're going to talk about some plants that have some specific anthelmintic or basically anti-parasite properties. We're going to talk about some ways that you can manage your pasture, and then some ideas for quarantining new animals. These are a list of some specific plants that you can consider either like planting as pasture for your goats, or growing to then sort of like provide as a supplement, like offering it to them. The reason why they have anti-parasite properties is most of them contain something called tannins. So that's just naturally like it doesn't create a good environment for the parasites, so it can like kill the parasites or stop them from reproducing that plant compound. The leaves, like chicory, the leaves are just a different well, they have tannins, but also they're sort of a different shape that's not very that the parasite larvae sort of don't like to migrate. And yeah, that's sort of the main thing. But here's some options to think about. Managing your pasture. if you have horses or cows, it can be really helpful to either co-graze, so have the goats and the horses or cows all grazing together, or to alternate areas. So like if you like running the goats in that paddock first and then following up with the cows or horses. And the reason why this can help manage parasites is because horses and cows, the parasites that affect them, the main ones are different from the ones that affect sheep, goats, and camelids, like llamas and alpacas. And so they'll essentially act as, people describe it as like a vacuum. So they'll basically like ingest, they'll eat the parasites that the goats are affected with. And they'll basically just like clean up the pasture because they're just eating the grass that has the larvae and those parasites. So something to think about. And then a lot of people ask how much or how long should I rest my pastures? It's difficult to give an exact answer because it all has to do with the actual conditions of the pasture, like in the environment. So the temperature, the moisture, all that. But here's sort of a good general guideline is for greater than 3 months in the warmer time, so spring and summer, or greater than 6 months in the cooler time, so autumn or winter. Specifically about quarantine, there's a lot of different options that you can do, and some of you might already be quarantining for other diseases. So this, I would say, is probably like some of these things like greater than 3 days. That I would say that's like the bare minimum. And then pairing it up with doing a fecal egg count or treating, I think is important. But yeah, housing your new goats in an area that's either like has no grass, so they're not able to pick anything up from the pasture, or housing them in an area that that you've already rested. So hopefully there's it's like a cleaner area that's useful. And then using these newer drenches, so the brand names are Zolvix and StarTech. And the reason why you would use those is because there's likely less resistance. So they haven't been out for as long. So hopefully not as many goats have been exposed to it, to the chemicals. So hopefully the parasites haven't genetically mutated to resist that. So hopefully you can kill 100% of the worms that you bring in onto your property by using a combination of the new ones and some other unrelated actives. And it is important to note that you can bring in drench resistance worms. And if a goat has worms, if it has been treated with worms in the past, there is a likelihood that it has drench resistance worms. And so let's say you're using Q drench on your property and you buy a mob of new goats that came from a place that had Q drench resistance, you could potentially be introducing Q drench resistant goats onto your property, which would not be great for all the rest of your goats that you're currently managing when you need to. You're currently managing with Q drench. So please do remember that you can bring in drench resistance worms. So talking to the people that you bought them from, you know, asking if they have worm problems, do they know that, do they have a problem with drench resistance, and what drugs do they use, things like that can be useful to get a history, and or doing a proper quarantine. So that's a potentially testing when, and only testing their fecal egg counts, either doing a reduction test or testing it and only releasing them from quarantine when their count is 0. Oh, and just one last thing, releasing the goat from quarantine into an area that has worms that are hopefully susceptible to the drug. So not into a clean area, releasing them into a dirty area. So to wrap it up, we talked about a lot of different strategies. Again, I sort of gave you a bit more of a list, if anything. But the whole point is keep this information, have a think about what strategies might work with your specific herd on your property, with the resources that you have, and then, find a vet or work with a vet or just compile a document together, come up with a plan to incorporate these strategies, write it down so that you actually have something to go on in the future. If you need to have a plan of attack to manage worms, or as a current management strategy if you're struggling right now, or you want to upgrade what you're doing. Utilize as many methods as you can. Work with your vets, but also don't be afraid to educate your vets. If there's things that I talked about on this that your vet has never heard about, but like you want to make sure you're getting the right dose right, or you want to talk to them about copper oxide wire particles and they've never heard about that, then talk to them about it. Refer them to someone else like me or Dr. Sandra Baxendale who knows about these things, who has some resources, because it's very important that vets as well as people like you are learning, because otherwise these problems will continue to be a struggle and people won't really know how to help goats. So I talked about drench resistance. So what happens if you have drench resistance? So based on that reduction test, if you have a less than 95% reduction in eggs, which you can see how to do it on Worm Boss. That's an awesome resource. They've got some more information. But what happens if you have less than 95% of a reduction in eggs, and you're using that first line, you're using the Q-drench or the levamisole or the fenbendazole? Well, there's sort of a bit of a hierarchy of drugs that I would recommend. So if you know that you've got resistance that's diagnosed by the reduction test, then trying Zolvex in your herd. And then if you know that you've got resistance again to that's diagnosed, then trying the newest product, StarTest. But definitely saving these ones as a last resort, because there's not that many drench drugs that are being made. They're not coming out very frequently because it's a long process to release drugs. And these are sort of all that we have and all that we will have for the near future. So utilize a bunch of different methods to control, and also be responsible with which drugs that you're choosing first. So starting with those first lines for your goats is very important. So that basically, that's pretty much all I've got. I wanted a lot of time for questions. So yeah, hopefully you guys can have some good questions. And I do have my email. If you do think of anything else, or if you want to get in touch with me to help create a worm control plan or something like that, my email is livestockveterinaryconsultancy@gmail.com. Thank you.
Thanks, Marisa. There's some fantastic information in there. And as I said earlier, you'll have access to those slides. So everyone can go back and have a look over those. If you do have any questions, type them in the box, please. I've got one for you, Marisa. Do you recommend rotating between drenches? For example, if you're using Q-drench, maybe mixing it up and giving biowormer?
That's an interesting question. I think you might actually have two different parts. Bioworma isn't considered a drench, so that's actually that's the fungal spore. So that's an organic product. That's an additive. So I wouldn't call that a drench. So definitely you can use Q-drench and bioworma. But when it comes to rotating the drenches, I don't recommend doing that as your standard plan. I think rotate if like only switch to a new drench if you have diagnosed drench resistance with the fecal egg count reduction test. So if you and that's the thing is if you never test that your drench works, then how are you ever going to know that it works, right? So yeah, so first test that your drench actually works, and you can just do that once in a few goats. And then if you know that it doesn't work, then consider switching to that, second or third one.
Gotcha. Great tip. And the other one with the refugia group, so the 10%, minimum 10% you're not treating, are they the ones with the lowest egg count that you're not treating?
Yeah, so naturally there'll be a range of goats that are affected by the parasites differently. So some will just have, again, and that's why genetics is important to think about, because some will just be able to resist the parasites more than others. So again, the 10% is just a guideline. If you Haemonchus scored all of your goats, every single one of them, and they're white, then if they've got white mucous membranes, then there's a massive issue there. But generally speaking, there will be some goats in the herd that aren't as affected as others, so they will have lower fecal egg count.
Yep. Gotcha. Thanks. Lots of questions coming through. Terrific work, everyone. First one here. I'm in tropical Queensland with high humidity levels and high rainfall. I've had 2 female goats contained 0 greys for 6 months. I believed 70 to 90 days would be the time frame for natural death of the worms in the gut. I'm now only post-kitting starting to see 2 to 3 consecutive 0 counts. I saw a small spike prior to kitting, 200 EPG, even at 6 months containment. Is it likely that some worms were inhibited? I'm working very hard at keeping everything clean of drop food. Sorry, there's a lot there.
I'm just trying to figure out what do you mean by inhibited?
Yeah, maybe we can come back to that one.
Yeah,
Can you use both Tracerite and Smart Trace together?
that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure that that the intraruminal bolus does contain copper, the smart trace. I personally wouldn't give two supplements that contain copper. I'd have to just double check because again that's off the top of my head because some of the boluses don't have copper in them. But if it has copper, then don't give 2 supplements with copper. If that makes sense. Just because there is a chance for copper toxicity.
Thank you. I've been told by several people not to feed lupins to my does, and they can have problems with breeding, as in birthing and deformities. Do you know much about that?
I haven't heard anything specifically about lupins causing birthing deformities. It, yeah, I would have to do some more research about that, but I haven't heard about that. I do know that it's a great source of protein and energy. It can be a great supplement to give,
Yep.
especially to prevent things like worms, like pregnancy toxemia, which if you catch Sandra's webinar next, she'll talk about that as well.
Thanks, Marisa. I follow the biowormer instructions for administration, but given how expensive it is it okay to deliver every other day or seasonally?
That's a good question. Definitely seasonally. Like if specifically, so if you can't afford it, like some is better than none because it is helpful in reducing the larvae on the pasture. If you genuinely can't afford to feed it every day, then consider feeding it around that period around kidding. So sort of like before and after kidding, or feeding it specifically to goats that are more susceptible, like goats that are being weaned, pregnant goats, lactating goats, right? So if you do have to make a choice, then using it to target the goats that are more effective is good. I'm not sure about every other day. I haven't heard of people doing it every other day. Yeah, so I can't give you a specific answer on that, but I would assume, I mean, the spores would still go through them. They'd hatch in the poop. They'd entrap the larvae in the poop. So they would still kill some larvae in the poop.
Great. With refugia period, do you find it is more suitable to more intensive production systems with healthy animals versus as a vet when I see sudden deaths, clinical cases, often in overstock systems and high worm burdens. So welfare may be compromised if I leave 10 to 20% undrenched. Thus, I often find I advise whole flock drenching.
I see, I get it. I guess my question for you is, are you using targeted selective treatment? So are you treating the ones that need to be treated and just leaving the other ones, or are you just blanket picking 10%? I'm just, or 20%, to not be treated. I'm just interested.
Yep, that makes sense. About the EPG scores, your recommendation of treating when these scores are greater than 500, is this for all breeds of goat? I've been drenching my pygmy goat when scores are above 200.
Yep. So all goats generally, and then within, if you want to get into a little bit more specifics, using it for the 500 for the ones that are more susceptible. So weaners, pregnant, lactating goats, and then using actually a bit higher cutoff, 750 for the ones like your bucks, your dry does. Yeah, your adult dry.
Thank you. If I was seeing 0 counts for a number of weeks, then prior to kidding an increase, is there a chance they were reinfected or worms already in the gut had gone dormant and then emerging with relaxation?
I guess it sort of depends on how much time was from your 0 count. So remember, the fecal A count is a snapshot point in time. So the worms are going to be excreting, like Haemonchus, the Barber worm can excrete something like 10,000 eggs a day or something. So they're just going to be shedding eggs at certain periods of time. So you might have caught one time where there were 0 eggs, but around the kidding period, they are more susceptible, so their immune system goes down. So it potentially could be both. They could have either have had a very small amount of worms inside them, or picked up some larvae on the pasture, or unfortunately there's a larvae stage where the parasites can actually become dormant, so sort of hibernate inside the goat. So it wouldn't be actively releasing eggs, but it could evolve given the right conditions. It could basically grow up and then start shedding eggs. So that one's, a bit hard to say, but it could have potentially picked up something, or it could have come from inside.
Great. Next one, relatively new to boar goats, and when purchasing my first lot of does, the breeder, they recommended Zolvix. I have used that for the past 18 months. Having introduced some new bloodlines, should I consider dropping back to an older drench or just liaise with a vet, not wanting to increase the chance of the goats becoming immune?
Great question. Again, if you can do anything that you can to minimize the parasites from evading the chemical treatment, then I would. So if you can, firstly, do a reduction test on your current one to see like how that Zolvex is working for you. And then considering switching to one of those first line drenches like the Q drench. But again, doing a test to see if it works. And yeah, work with your vet and talk to this about them. Raise your concerns about drench resistance.
Yeah, thanks. I think we did touch on this on a little bit. Does bioworm need to be added every day to be effective?
Mm.
Or can you skip a day?
Yeah, similar
Yep.
to what I said before.
Yep.
Yeah.
Uh, Lots of questions. Great. Is biowormer a good idea for a new goat in quarantine before introducing to current herd?
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah. It can be used in quarantine. It will, again, it'll help keep the larvae numbers down in the area that they are in quarantine. So it'll, if anything, it'll just help. Yeah, for sure.
We are about to wean our kids, so do we do a fecal egg count and drench straight away or wait until the results come back before drenching the kids?
Hmm. That's a good question. I personally think if you're, well, it's up to you. If you've never resistance tested your chemical, then doing that resistance test can be useful. But you can still use your targeted selective treatment. So when you get all your weaners through, you can still pick out the ones that, aren't meeting your growth targets or seem skinny or have diarrhea or have pale mucous membranes, and then test that. So if you think they do need to be treated, um, you can take the fecal egg counts on the day that you treat it, and then the 14 days later, and then calculate that reduction. Otherwise, if you just want to be extra cautious and use that as a method of targeted selective treatment, then you can fecal egg count all of them, either individually or with a bulk sample, and then that can help you.
Terrific. And in relation to plants, does wattle have an anti-worm properties?
Wattle. I haven't heard specifically about that plant,
Yep,
but I can look into it.
great. On biowormer again, if you have 40 odd goats and put it in their food mix, is that enough for them all to get some to be effective?
Yep. You can dose it that way. Just calculate the individual dose rates. Yeah.
Has there been much research into pour-on drenches for goats? I think you did touch on it, the oral being most effective.
Yep. So yeah, oral is definitely the most effective products that you want to use. Unfortunately, people still do use the injectable and pour on, but there's too many drench options out there. I would just stick with the oral ones.
Great. A FAMACHA score. How can I get a FAMACHA online training with certificate?
Oh yeah. You can feel free to either email me or Dr. Sandra does them online. You can find her at Goat Vet Oz. She's got a great online course that I did actually.
Lovely. Currently in a dry Australian summer, I'm feeding given pasture currently, maybe supplementary feeding given pasture currently isn't an option. Currently feeding some lucerne in the morning and a mixture of cracked maize, lupins, oats, barley, and goat pellets in the arvo. Does this sound sustainable or healthy, as I find that grain recipes online seem to vary so much?
Mm, great question. Um, I personally stay away from giving um, goats super high carbohydrate supplements. So things with like what did you say it was oats in there or something like corn and oats and things like that. Um, I would stick to something more like the lupins because that has carbohydrates and it has protein. So there's less risk for ruminal acidosis.
Thanks. This is an interesting one. If you have a pair of goats as pets, aside from health and diet management, is the impact of worms and parasites a issue as large as you have been talking about compared to, say, a bigger number of goats, larger number?
Great question. Thanks for that. Definitely, yeah. So no matter, even if you just have one goat or if you have 5,000 goats, there's still an issue in goats. They are more susceptible than sheep just because of their sort of genetic makeup and evolutionary history. And sometimes you'll get lucky, and one goat will be immune and very equipped to deal with the parasite infections themselves, and sometimes you won't. So it's definitely still a problem with just two. And sometimes it can actually be more difficult to control, because if you have two goats in your backyard or something like that, or if you've got a smaller amount of land, um, then there can sort of be like a really high buildup of the larvae and the parasites in the area that you keep your goats. So that's where something like feeding bioworma would be perfect for your situation. You can have them come to you, eat out of your hand as a treat every day, with their little grain mix. And it won't be that expensive because you only have two goats, and it's super effective, and it'll help keep that larvae on the pasture down for you.
Thanks, Marisa. Great answer. Next one, is there a natural alternative for lungworm parasites?
Unfortunately not,
Straight to the
that I
point
know
with that answer. My vet has just used Closantal as a drench with my Nigerian dwarves. What is your opinion of this drench for goats specifically?
So closantal is so that's the active ingredient. That's also an active ingredient found in Q drench. So if again, like everything, like test your drench to see if it works. If you're using something, test it and see if it works. Because it only has one active chemical ingredient, the parasites could theoretically develop resistance faster, if especially if they're not being if sort of all the ideal conditions aren't met. They're not getting the right amount, if the drench isn't stored at the right temperature. So if you're keeping it in your shed, if you're not shaking it, or if it's expired, things like that. So it could potentially be an issue, especially in the future, but it would be worth doing a fecal egg count reduction testing. Yeah.
Why are there no tests to tell you when the withholding period is over, i.e. the levels are safe? As we touched on, technically Q drench is not approved for goats. How can we adequately drench when there are so few chemicals available?
Right. So you can legally, you can drench if you have a prescription. Even if Q drench on the label, it doesn't say registered for goats, that's fine. It doesn't matter, because if you have a vet prescription, and then they'll give the dose, right? They'll give the withholding period, then you're allowed to use that product, right? And wait, sorry, there was the safety, the withholding. Yeah, unfortunately, that's a whole nother rabbit hole. The Goat Industry Council of Australia is currently, like, that is one of their top priority projects right now. They're working on that, because there has been some residue detected. So right now there's what's called maximum residue limit. So that's basically the amount of chemical that the government sets that's allowed in the animal product. And right now, because goats, there's just not enough research. They haven't done the research. The reason why they haven't done the research is because they don't have the funding, and that's just because unfortunately the goat industry is just smaller than other industries like sheep and cattle, right? So the research just isn't there. The funding just isn't there. So the residue limits are currently 0, the maximum residue limits, which means that you cannot have any amount of residues detected, which means that it's extra important for the vet to prescribe an appropriate withholding period, and extra important that you get a prescription from the vet that has a withholding period. Because otherwise, I mean, who knows? Like, you're just giving a chemical and waiting X amount of time, right? So there are resources out there for vets to prescribe an appropriate withholding period. There has been some research done. There's resources out there. Whether or not your specific vet has access to those resources is a different question. So a lot of vets just might not know, and unfortunately maybe prescribe the same withholding period as for sheep or cattle. So again, like it's important to be working with your veterinarian, but also making sure that they're up to date with sort of the current information, and referring someone, if you do have a vet that you work with that isn't that confident in goats or unable to give you goat specific information, you know, letting them know, hey, look, there are some vets out there, like me and Dr. Sandra, for example, who are interested in goats and have some updated information. And we are more than happy to share resources, papers, like more than happy to share with any vet, because it is very important that that you guys can access vets that know things about goats, because we like goats and we want them to be nice and healthy.
Great answer. Next one, nice talk. Do you have any data for fecal egg count interpretation in Australian goats in low, medium, and high shedders? Shedders, I think.
Hmm. Oh, I think, do you mean like of the ones that, like the ones that are more susceptible, like what numbers are they frequently shedding versus the ones that are less susceptible? I think
I'd
that's
assume
what I'm
so.
understanding from that.
Yep.
Look, I mean, the numbers can be so variable. Like there you can get, I've done fecal egg counts that have had, you know, like thousands and thousands and thousands of eggs. So you can get a lot of eggs and you can get some with not that many. I don't have a specific reference at this point in time for you about certain, you know, low and medium and high cheddars. Sorry about that.
Yep. Pumpkins or pumpkin seeds helpful to reduce worms?
Good question. I personally have not found, based on my many hours of reviewing the literature, I have not found anything that said that pumpkin seeds are effective. So it's unfortunate. There's a lot of potential things that people recommend, like, you know, natural products, right? Organic, like non-chemical methods. And some have the research to back it up and some just don't. So something like pumpkin seeds, I haven't found the research to back it up. That doesn't mean that maybe they're effective. Like, I don't know, like maybe there's some anecdotal evidence, but I'm not sure. I haven't found that research. So just from a recommendation standpoint, sticking to something that has had the research, like bioworma, which is just, I mean, that's just fungal spores, right? That's organic, doesn't have any withholding period. That's just found, you know, in the environment. Like that would be a good alternative that has a lot of research to back it up, and we know that it works.
Great. Are bucks or does more susceptible to parasites?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about the specific, if there's been specific gender studies, or sex studies, but I think just because of like, because does can either be pregnant or lactating, that puts them in more stress, right? So like nutritional stress, physiological, like physical stress than a buck, although potentially a buck during rut, which is also in a bit more stress, could be more susceptible at that time. And again, during weaning, they could both be more susceptible. So I don't have a specific, this sex is more susceptible versus that. I think it's just more about the life stage.
Thank you. If your goat has a 4 or 5 Haemonchus score and is unwell, would you still withhold feed before worming? Are there some drenches that you wouldn't use in this situation?
Yeah, I don't think withholding food, if like if an animal's obviously unwell, then that's probably not a method that I would pick. You know, I would pick some other strategies. Yeah. Oh, and then there was some other, what was the other part? Specific drug.
Is there are there certain drenches you wouldn't use in this situation?
Oh. Um, Not specifically. I think either of the drenches that are used appropriately, if it's at the right dose rate, if you stored it properly, um, then they should be fine. Look, and again, remembering that ideally avoiding the chemical treatment, like that's the best option, is to avoid the chemical treatment to begin with, because you are putting chemicals into the body, right? But
Hmm.
if they have severe disease, if you're like, I can't get it under control with all these other methods, and my animal's potentially going to die, like I need something that's just going to get in there and kill all the parasites, then use it, right?
Yep. A couple of supplement questions coming through. When giving supplements, are animal lick blocks effective when used with goats? Um,
Hmm. Yeah, like lick blocks do contain vitamins and minerals. It's just, I guess, more of an issue of, is the animal getting the right amount for them? Because it all has to do with how much they're licking it. Um, and if the lick block has salt in it and you're also giving like a supplemental salt lick, like would they be encouraged to lick one over the other? So yeah, I think it's more of a dosing issue.
and would you be able to explain urea as a supplement? Go into detail about the dosage?
Um, yeah, so specific details about the dosage, I would say chat to your vet or a nutritionist to help you. It is they can have too much urea, so it's important not to overdose, but it's used as what's called a non-protein nitrogen supplement. So it's a product that the rumen that they can digest that converts to protein. So they can kind of digest it as protein. It's just like it's very complicated. It's a whole different pathway than eating the protein like from a lutein. So it's another source. It can be a lot cheaper. Like I know they use it up north, like for the cattle stations, for the animals like in the Pilbara and stuff like that, where they've got to dose a lot of animals. They need supplement protein, and they want to keep the cost down. So it can be done, but just yeah, chat to your vet, because you do want to have the appropriate dose, because they can be overdosed with it.
Right. And last supplementary question, is supplementing with copper sulfate at Colby style effective?
Mm. That's a great question. You hear a lot of people talking about it. It's it's definitely not the mode of copper supplement that I would choose. I would 100% choose the the copper oxide wire particles over the copper sulfate. Copper sulfate it's not like the research is just not there compared to the copper oxide wire particles when you're talking about the worms, and also it's a lot more dangerous. So it's much easier for them to overdose on copper. So remember, I was saying copper is you can overdose, you can get toxicity, and in goats it can happen. They are more susceptible. So especially if you're giving like I've heard a lot of people do like a free choice, like a mineral bar or something like that, and in one of them they have a container of the blue copper sulfate. And that's just unregulated. Like a goat could have as much as they possibly want. Like that is a recipe for disaster, because they can very easily, and they will, like it has been done before. It has been seen of having too much copper. So yeah, I would definitely avoid copper sulfate, just avoid avoid that, and
Yep.
choose the copper oxide wire particles.
Gotcha. Thank you for the seminar, Marissa. You mentioned coat score as an indicator of condition. Is there a way to factor in the molt?
Hmm. That's a good question. I actually haven't thought about that. Um,
Get back to you. We can get back to you on that one.
yeah, I'll
Yep.
get back to you on that.
If you had to pick one kidding season per year for boar goats in Southern Australia, would you pick autumn or spring?
Ooh, that's also a good question. I don't have experience farming in South Australia. I've only been there once to Adelaide for a conference.
Yeah,
So I can't really comment on ideal conditions. But yeah, so sorry about that.
yeah, no, that makes sense. And one more here. Sorry about for my typos before. Sorry. Only if time to follow. I ended up treating the whole flock. I think we had this question previously, but this wasn't clarity. So I ended up treating the whole flock as they all often have very high worm burdens and are clinical and some dying by the time I get there. I get called out. Thus, I start with blanketing in small flocks and target later once they are healthy, as I often don't deem it suitable to leave the 10 to 20% as they are often severely anemic and on the brink of death. So in that situation, um, would you consider a blanket treatment?
Yeah, yeah. So definitely, and I think I did mention this before. It's
Yeah.
like it's ideal if you don't treat everyone, and you can only know who to treat if you use that targeted selective treatment, principles, the ideas. But if all of them are on the brink of death and have pale, white mucous membrane and are dying, right, then definitely treat them. So yeah, yeah, for sure. Don't leave ones that you could potentially do something about it. Yeah.
Yep. And one more has just come through. Is there a certain percentage of macros, like protein, fiber, etc., that provide better worm resilience? I.e., goats should have 18% protein in daily feed, lactating should get 20%.
Mm. That's another great question. I think that's a specific, like a bit more of a specific nutritionist, like talk to your vet or nutrition, to come up with a
Hmm.
plan for your herd. But definitely like that amount of protein is a good amount of protein. As long as they are meeting, like I would say supplementing any protein, especially if they're on quite a poor pasture, or poor quality hay, things like that. Just supplementing any protein in any amount is still going to boost that immunonutrition.
Thanks, Marisa. That's it for the questions. I think we got through 33 of them, so well done.
Thanks
Yep.
everyone. I love it. Love that you were asking lots of questions, and yeah, did my best to answer them.
Yeah, great. Oh, one more, just quickly. I think you might know this one. How long can worms remain viable if in goats removed from pasture, roughly?
In in the goats or on the pasture?
I
That's
think
my
in
question.
goats removed from pasture. So probably in the goats.
Okay. Yeah. So tip the whole life cycle is about 3 weeks. So that's from the the egg to the adult that then sheds eggs again. So you're looking at I think I'm pretty sure, like this is just off the top of my head. I have to
Yeah.
get you specifics, but I'm pretty sure you're looking at a couple weeks for the adult to be inside. Yeah, and then 3 weeks for like the full 2 to 3 weeks for the full life cycle.
And I think Worm Boss, the website, have some good resources around.
Yeah, Warren Boss is
And
awesome, and they'll like I didn't get to touch specifically on all the different types of worms and all that. Just not quite not enough time for that. But yeah, definitely have a look on Warren Boss for all the specific parasites and all that.
great. Thanks again, Marissa, for your time and for all your wealth of information. It's been great.
You
And I
are
think
welcome.
everyone's got some information out of tonight, hopefully. And I think that's why the webinars are a good idea, as we can answer the live questions and they can be a bit more tailored to each person. This will be sent out to everyone. So yeah, look out for an email. Thanks for joining us. And don't forget, next week we have Dr. Sandra Baxendale, who's going to be talking on kidding, pregnancy, toxemia, and care of newborns. So look forward to that one. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.